G'day guys, it's Peachy. I wanted to talk to you today about fishing a nymph under a dry fly. Now, one of the first things that we're usually taught when we start fishing is if you want to add a nymph under your dry fly, you just tie a length of line off the bend of the hook and add a nymph below that. Well, that works, but I'd argue there's a much better way to do it in most circumstances, and that's what we're going to cover today. So there are two main problems as I see it with fishing a nymph straight off the bend of the hook. The first one is the dry fly is not able to drift naturally because it's tethered at both ends by both the nymph and the leader, and so it doesn't get a natural drift. So really, if you're fishing a nymph tied off the bend of the hook, most of the time you're just fishing the dry fly as an indicator for the nymph. You're not really fishing it effectively as a dry fly. The second problem is that if a fish does try to come up and eat that dry fly, it's tethered under tension at two ends. So you can imagine if a fish comes up and tries to eat that dry fly, it's going to hit tippet at the front of the fly and at the back of the fly. And that tends to push the dry fly out of the fish's mouth and result in a lot of missed hookups. Another problem that can occur is because the nymph is drifting slower than the dry fly, because the water down deeper is moving slower, it's pulling the back of the fly around. So the fly is drifting downstream with the hook pointed towards the fish when the fish is coming up and trying to eat it in this direction. And that also results in a poor hookup rate. Now the solution to this is to fish the dry fly and the nymph off a separate dropper. What that means is that the dry fly is allowed to have a little bit of independence in the way that it drifts from the nymph. You still get perfectly good indication of when you get a take on the nymph, but you get a much more natural drift on the dry fly. You also tend to get the dry fly floating downstream in a more normal direction with the hook pointed away from the fish, so that when the fish comes up and tries to eat it, it's only got one point of contact on the line on the dry fly, and the fish is eating it and then pulling it away from the barb of the hook. So you get a far, far better hookup rate on a dry fly if it's tied off a separate dropper from the nymph. All right, so how do we go about adding a nymph if we've already got a dry fly tied on?
There are a couple of ways to do this, depending on the length of your leader. For a very long, fine dry fly leader, you're going to need to shorten things up, and I'll show you the best way to do that in a minute. But if you just want to add a nymph to your existing fly and leader, here's a neat way to do it. The traditional triple surgeon's knot is a pain to tie with a fly already attached, as it involves pulling the fly and the extra tippet through a loop 3 times, and it's easy to get into big tangle and ruin everything. This knot I'm going to show you is far simpler and less error prone.
This is a knot that Devin Olsen shared recently, which he uses for tying dropper tags, but I've found it's a really effective knot for adding a dropper or adding a length of line below your dry fly or nymph when you've already got a fly tied on and you don't want to bother cutting it off. So what we do, we cut our length of line for how deep we want the nymph to be, and then I'm going to pinch these two lines together about 8 inches up above the dry fly. So I'm going to pinch those two lines together in my left hand, and I'm going to form an overhand loop and catch that loop in the pinch of my hand, like that. Then I'm going to stick my finger through the loop, twist it around twice, and reach through that loop and grab both the dry fly and the dropper tag that I'm wanting to add. Now, I only have to pull that fly and the line through one loop in order to pull through. And then I just wet it and pull that knot tight. Trim off the top tag, and then I'm ready to tie on my nymph onto that bottom piece. I've created a separate dropper without having to take the fly off that I already had tied on.
Now, if I was fishing a really long, light 18-foot dry fly leader, then it's going to be too long to effectively cast a Nymph Under Dry rig, so I'll need to shorten it up. Here's what I would do instead. I always fish a small tippet ring in my dry fly leader at the end of a 12-foot tapered section. I would cut the tippet just about 6 to 8 inches above the dry fly, and then tie that piece of tippet with the dry fly attached onto the tippet ring. Then I can adjust the length of my other tippet section to set the depth and tie on the nymph to that piece. An even better method is to have separate tippet sections pre-rigged with flies attached on foam spools, and simply cut off at the tippet ring, store on a spool, and attach the new tippet section with flies. This is my favourite method of all, as it allows switching back and forth quickly and easily.
I think you'll find that fishing the dry fly off a separate dropper when you're fishing Nymph Under Dry is a far more effective way to fish. You're going to get a much better hookup rate and a lot more fish taking the dry if you do it this way.
Now, if you'd like to learn a super effective way to fish a single dry fly, then I suggest you have a look at this video.